Welcome to Stories of Slavery. This episode brings us to 1857 and tells the story of Moses Walker, a man the slave trade dismissed as worthless, who later became one of the most feared and sought after figures in Louisiana. What follows is a heavy account of injustice, endurance, and a transformation that history did not expect. Pause for a moment, take a breath, and listen closely. If these stories matter to you, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments the city and country you're listening from. Your engagement helps ensure these lives are remembered, not erased. Let's begin. In the summer of 1901, a historian from Harvard University traveled to a small town in Ontario, Canada, searching for a story that had become legend in the American South. He was looking for a man named Moses Walker. What he found instead was a grave in a quiet cemetery, a widow who still wept when she spoke her husband's name, and a tale so extraordinary that he spent the next 3 years trying to verify it. The story he uncovered would never appear in official history books. It was too brutal, too unsettling, too dangerous for a nation still healing from the wounds of slavery. But the historian wrote it down anyway in a private journal that would not be discovered until 1987, hidden in the archives of the university library. This is that story, the story of a man born with a face so disfigured that no one would buy him, a man who spent 32 years being treated as less than human, a man who became the most wanted fugitive in Louisiana history, and a man who destroyed everyone who ever made him suffer. His name was Moses Walker, and what he did in the year 1857 still haunts the bayous of Louisiana to this day. Let me take you back to a place called St. Landry Parish, in the heart of Cajun country. The year was 1825, and a baby was being born in a wooden shack behind the sugar fields of Bellefontaine Plantation. The midwife who delivered that baby was a 60-year-old enslaved woman named Aunt Cora. She had brought hundreds of children into the world over her lifetime. She had seen babies born too early, babies born too late, babies who lived and babies who died. She thought she had seen everything. She was wrong. When the baby emerged, Aunt Cora screamed. She stumbled backward, knocking over the basin of water, nearly dropping the newborn on the dirt floor. The other women in the shack rushed forward, thinking something had gone terribly wrong with the birth. Then they saw the baby's face, and they screamed too. The left side of the infant's face was covered in a massive purple growth. It spread from his forehead to his chin, engulfing his eye, distorting his features, making him look like something from a nightmare. His left eye was white and blank, without pupil or iris, like a marble pressed into raw meat. The skin around the growth was wrinkled and twisted, as if it had been melted and reformed by some terrible fire. "Devil child," Aunt Cora whispered, backing away. "That baby's been marked by the devil himself." The mother, a young woman named Sarah, who had labored for 16 hours to bring this child into the world, reached out with trembling hands. "Let me see him, let me see my baby." They gave her the child. Sarah looked at her son's face for a long moment. The other women waited for her to scream, to cry, to push the baby away in horror. Instead, she smiled. "He's beautiful," she said softly. "He's my beautiful boy." Sarah named him Moses, after the prophet who led his people out of slavery. She believed that God had a purpose for her son, even if she could not understand what it was. She believed that the mark on his face was not a curse but a sign, a symbol of something greater to come. Sarah died 3 days later from complications of childbirth. She never got to see her beautiful boy grow up. She never got to protect him from what was coming. Moses Walker entered the world alone, disfigured and motherless. And for the next 32 years, the world would make him pay for all three. Bellefontaine Plantation covered over 3,000 acres of prime Louisiana farmland. It was one of the largest sugar operations in St. Landry Parish, producing over 2 million pounds of sugar annually. The plantation was home to 612 enslaved people who worked the cane fields from sunrise to sunset, cutting and processing the stalks that made their owner one of the wealthiest men in the state. That owner was Colonel Philippe Beaumont. Colonel Beaumont was 58 years old in 1857, the third generation of his family to own Bellefontaine. His grandfather had carved the plantation out of raw swampland in 1785, fighting alligators, disease, and hostile Native Americans to establish a foothold in the Louisiana wilderness. His father had expanded it, buying up neighboring farms, acquiring more enslaved workers, and building the grand white mansion that dominated the landscape like a temple to wealth and power. Philippe Beaumont had inherited all of this at age 25, and he had spent the next 3 decades proving he was worthy of the legacy. He was a shrewd businessman, a ruthless negotiator, and a respected member of Louisiana society. He served in the state legislature. He donated generously to the Catholic Church. He hosted lavish parties that attracted the elite of the South. He was also, by any standard of human decency, a monster. Colonel Beaumont collected things, fine wines from France, antique furniture from England, rare books from around the world. But his most prized collection was something else entirely. He collected instruments of torture. His private study contained over 40 devices designed to inflict pain on the human body. Thumb screws from medieval Spain, branding irons from the Caribbean, whips with metal tips that could strip flesh from bone, masks that forced the wearer's mouth open, making it impossible to speak or scream. Beaumont had acquired these items from estate sales, private dealers, and fellow collectors who shared his interests, and he used them. Not often, not publicly, but when a slave needed to be disciplined, when an example needed to be made, Colonel Beaumont would retire to a special room in the basement of the mansion. What happened in that room was known only to the victims and to Beaumont himself, but the screams could sometimes be heard from the slave quarters, carried on the wind like the cries of damned souls. Beaumont had a philosophy about slavery that he would share with anyone who asked. He believed that Africans were not fully human. He believed that their souls were corrupted, tainted by centuries of heathen worship. And he believed that suffering could purify those souls, could burn away the corruption and make them worthy of salvation. "I am not cruel," he would say, swirling expensive brandy in a crystal glass. "I am merciful. I am giving them the gift of purification. They should thank me." Moses Walker was his favorite subject. From the moment Moses was old enough to work, Beaumont had taken a special interest in him. The boy's disfigured face fascinated the colonel. He saw it as proof of his theories about African corruption. Here was a child so tainted that the corruption had manifested physically, mocking him for all to see. Beaumont tried to sell Moses 3 times. The first attempt came when Moses was 12 years old. The colonel brought him to a slave auction in New Orleans, hoping some buyer might take the boy off his hands. But when Moses was displayed on the auction block, the crowd reacted with disgust. Buyers turned away. Some laughed. One man spat on the ground and said he would not take such a creature for free. Moses stood on that block for 4 hours. No one bid a single dollar. The second attempt came when Moses was 18. Beaumont lowered the asking price to $100, a fraction of what a healthy young male slave was worth. Again, no buyers. "That thing would scare my horses," one farmer said. "It would give my children nightmares." The third attempt came when Moses was 25. By then, Beaumont had given up on getting any money for him. He offered Moses as a bonus a free addition to any purchase of 5 or more slaves. Still, no one wanted him. "I don't need bad luck on my plantation," a buyer explained. "A face like that brings nothing but trouble." After the third failed sale, Colonel Beaumont accepted that Moses was unsellable. He was stuck with the disfigured slave for life. And since he could not profit from Moses, he decided to use him for something else, entertainment. Moses was assigned to the most degrading jobs on the plantation. He cleaned the latrines, digging out human waste with his bare hands and carrying it to the fields as fertilizer. He collected the bodies of slaves who died and transported them to the burial ground, sometimes dragging corpses for miles in the summer heat. He was the one who cleaned up after punishments, mopping blood from floors, disposing of severed fingers or ears that had been removed as discipline. But that was not enough for Beaumont. He wanted more. Whenever the colonel hosted dinner parties, Moses was ordered to serve at the table. Not because he was skilled at service, but because his presence created a reaction. Guests would gasp when they saw him. Women would cover their mouths, men would make cruel jokes. Behold, Madame Beaumont would announce, gesturing toward Moses with her wine glass. "Our little monster, isn't he fascinating? I keep him as a curiosity, like a two-headed calf or a bearded lady at the circus." The guests would laugh. Moses would stand motionless, his one good eye fixed on the floor, his face betraying nothing. Inside he was screaming. Inside he was dying, but outside he showed nothing. He had learned long ago that showing emotion only made things worse. Madame Céline Beaumont was in some ways crueler than her husband. The colonel's cruelty was cold and calculated, driven by twisted philosophy and a desire for control. Madame Beaumont's cruelty was personal. She enjoyed watching Moses suffer. She enjoyed humiliating him. She enjoyed reminding him at every opportunity that he was less than nothing. "My pet monster," she called him, scratching him behind the ear like a dog when guests were watching. So ugly that even the devil wouldn't claim him, but useful for entertaining company. She had rules for Moses. He was not allowed to look at white people directly. He was not allowed to speak unless spoken to. He was not allowed to eat until everyone else on the plantation had finished, which often meant he went to bed hungry. He was required to bow whenever a member of the Beaumont family passed, even if they passed him a dozen times a day. Violations of these rules were punished immediately, not with whipping. That would leave marks, and Madame Beaumont wanted her monster presentable for guests. Instead, she had creative punishments, making Moses stand in the sun for hours without water, locking him in a small box overnight, forcing him to eat his meals from a trough on his hands and knees, like a pig. But the worst torment came from Jacques Beaumont, the colonel's only son. Jacques was 24 years old in 1857, the heir to Bellefontaine and everything it represented. He had been raised with every privilege imaginable: private tutors, European travel, the finest clothes and horses money could buy. He had never worked a day in his life and never intended to. His only skills were drinking, gambling, and inflicting pain on those weaker than himself. Jacques had discovered Moses when he was just 8 years old. He had been wandering the plantation, bored, looking for something to do, when he stumbled upon the disfigured slave cleaning out a stable. "What are you?" the boy had asked, staring at Moses' face with a mixture of horror and fascination. Moses, who was 16 at the time, had not known how to respond. He was not supposed to speak to members of the Beaumont family unless asked a direct question that required an answer. "I asked you a question, monster," Jacques had said, picking up a rock from the ground. "What are you?" "I am Moses, young master," Moses had replied, keeping his eyes down. "I work in the stables. You're ugly." Jacques had observed. "The ugliest thing I've ever seen. I bet you're ugly inside too. I bet if I cut you open, your guts would be ugly." And then, without warning, the 8-year-old boy had thrown the rock at Moses' face. It struck him on the jaw, splitting the skin, drawing blood. Jacques had laughed with delight. "You bleed red," he had said, surprised. "I thought monsters bled black." That was the beginning of 16 years of torment. As Jacques grew older, his cruelty grew more sophisticated. He graduated from throwing rocks to throwing knives. He would make Moses stand against a wall while he practiced his aim, seeing how close he could get without actually hitting him. Sometimes he missed on purpose, leaving Moses with cuts on his arms and legs that took weeks to heal. When Jacques was old enough to shoot, he used Moses for target practice. He would fire his pistol inches from Moses' head, laughing as the enslaved man flinched, as his ears rang from the explosion. "Dance, monster," he would shout, firing at Moses' feet, forcing him to jump and dodge. "Dance for me." Once, when Moses failed to dodge quickly enough, a bullet grazed his thigh. The wound became infected, and Moses nearly died. Colonel Beaumont was furious, not at his son for shooting a slave, but at the slave for getting injured and being unable to work. "Be more careful next time," he told Jacques. "That creature is useless enough without you crippling it." Jacques apologized to his father. He never apologized to Moses. By the time Moses was 32 years old, he had endured more suffering than most people could imagine. His body was covered in scars. His spirit had been broken and rebuilt so many times that it was held together by nothing but pure will. He had watched other slaves come and go, sold away to other plantations, escaping to the north, dying from disease or overwork or punishment. He had watched families torn apart, children ripped from their mothers, husbands separated from wives. He had seen the full horror of American slavery, and he had survived it all. But survival was not living. Moses Walker existed, but he did not live. He moved through his days like a ghost, performing his duties, enduring his torments, waiting for nothing except the release of death. And then something changed. In the spring of 1851, a Catholic priest arrived in St. Landry Parish. His name was Father Antoine Marchand, and he had been sent from New Orleans to minister to the spiritual needs of the rural communities. Officially, his job was to serve the white Catholic families of the region, performing masses, hearing confessions, baptizing babies. Unofficially, Father Marchand had another mission entirely. He was an abolitionist, not openly, of course. An open abolitionist in Louisiana in 1851 would have been hanged from the nearest tree. But Father Marchand believed that slavery was a sin against God, and he had dedicated his life to fighting it in whatever ways he could. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves find their way to freedom. Over the years, he had guided dozens of fugitives out of Louisiana, through Mississippi and Tennessee, up to the Free States and on to Canada. Father Marchand came to Bellefontaine on a Sunday morning in April to say Mass for the Beaumont family. The colonel and his wife sat in the front pew, dressed in their finest clothes, performing their weekly display of piety. The slaves attended from the back of the chapel standing, because there were no seats for them, listening to a service in a language most did not understand. The priest noticed Moses immediately. Everyone noticed Moses. But while others looked at the disfigured face and saw a monster, Father Marchand saw something else. He saw intelligence, he saw awareness, he saw a mind trapped behind that ruined face, watching, analyzing, waiting. After the Mass, Marchand found an excuse to speak with Moses. He asked for help carrying some books to his carriage. As they walked together, the priest asked a simple question: "Can you read?" Moses was so startled that he almost dropped the books. Reading was forbidden. Teaching a slave to read was a crime in Louisiana, punishable by heavy fines for the teacher and severe whipping for the slave. The question itself was dangerous, but something in the priest's eyes told Moses that this was not a trap. This was an opportunity. "No, Father," Moses said carefully, "I cannot read." Marchand nodded slowly. "Would you like to learn?" Moses did not answer immediately. He had spent 30 years learning to suppress his desires, his hopes, his dreams. He had learned that wanting things only led to disappointment, but here was a white man, a priest, offering him something that could change everything. "Yes," Moses finally said, "I would like to learn." That Sunday began a secret education that would last 3 years. Father Marchand visited Bellefontaine, regularly officiating at masses, hearing confessions, performing the duties expected of a parish priest. But late at night, in an abandoned cabin at the edge of the swamp, he met with Moses and taught him to read. They started with the Bible, the only book that would not arouse suspicion if discovered. Moses learned his letters by candlelight, tracing them with his finger, sounding them out in a whispered voice. He learned words, then sentences, then paragraphs. Within 6 months, he was reading fluently. Within a year, he was reading everything the priest could bring him. Father Marchand was amazed by Moses' intelligence. The enslaved man absorbed knowledge like dry earth absorbing rain. He read histories of ancient civilizations and understood the patterns of rise and fall. He read philosophy and grasped concepts that university students struggled with. He read law books and memorized the statutes that governed slavery in Louisiana, learning the system that oppressed him with the same precision he might learn the workings of a machine. "You have a remarkable mind," the priest told him one night. "In another life you could have been a scholar, a leader, a great man." Moses looked at him with his one good eye. "In this life, I am property. My mind belongs to Colonel Beaumont, just like my body. Bodies can be owned," March and said. "Minds cannot. Your thoughts are your own. No one can take them from you." Moses considered this. "Then my thoughts are the only free thing about me. For now," the priest said, "but perhaps not forever." Over the following months, their conversations shifted from education to something more dangerous. March told Moses about the Underground Rail, wrote about the network of safe houses and secret routes that helped slaves escape to freedom. He told him about Canada, where slavery was illegal, where black men and women lived as free citizens. He told him that escape was possible, that freedom was possible, that a different life was possible. Moses listened carefully to everything. He memorized routes and contacts and codes. He learned which stars to follow, which rivers to cross, which signs marked safe houses. He stored all this information in his remarkable memory, building a mental map of liberation, but Moses was not planning to use this knowledge for himself. Not yet. He had other plans first, because Moses had also been asking the priest different questions. Questions about the Beaumont family's business dealings, questions about the political situation in Louisiana, questions about how power worked, how it could be obtained, and how it could be destroyed. Father March and began to realize that he was not simply teaching a slave to read. He was arming a weapon. In the fall of 1854, a new slave arrived at Bellefontaine. Her name was Delilah. She was 25 years old, tall and strong, with hands that showed the calluses of hard labor. She had been purchased from a plantation in South Carolina that was liquidating its assets after the owner's death. She was assigned to the main house, working in the kitchen and helping with cleaning. Delilah had her own history of sorrow. She had been married to a man named Thomas, and together they had a daughter named Grace. When Grace was 3 years old, the master sold Thomas to a plantation in Mississippi. A year later, he sold Grace to a buyer in Atlanta. Delilah never saw her husband or daughter again. The loss had nearly destroyed her. For months after Grace was taken, Delilah barely ate, barely spoke, barely functioned. She moved through her days like a ghost, going through the motions of life without actually living. Part of her had died when that wagon carried her daughter away, and she did not know if it would ever come back. Then she came to Bellefontaine, and she met Moses Walker. The first time Delilah saw Moses, she did not look away. She did not gasp or grimace or make a cruel comment. She simply looked at him, met his eyes for a moment, and then went about her business. That simple act of ordinary humanity was so unusual that Moses did not know how to process it. For 30 years, every encounter with another person had been defined by his face: horror, disgust, mockery, pity at best. But this woman had looked at him as if he were just another person, as if his face did not matter. They began talking small conversations at first, the kind of cautious exchanges that enslaved people learned to have, saying little of substance in case someone was listening. But over time, as they grew to trust each other, the conversations deepened. Delilah told Moses about Thomas and Grace, about the grief that never went away, about the prayers she said every night, hoping that somewhere, somehow, her daughter was still alive. Moses told Delilah about his life, about the years of torment, about the secret education with Father March, and about the plans that were forming in his mind, plans he had never spoken aloud to anyone. What kind of plans? Delilah asked one night when they were alone behind the kitchen. Moses was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Plans to make them pay." Delilah did not flinch. She did not tell him such thoughts were dangerous. She did not counsel patience or forgiveness or acceptance. Instead, she reached out and touched his face, the disfigured side, the part that no one ever touched. "Tell me," she said, and Moses did. Their relationship deepened over the following months. They found stolen moments together, hidden from the eyes that were always watching. They fell in love, though neither dared to use that word. Love was a luxury slaves could not afford. Love was a vulnerability, a weakness that could be exploited. If the Beaumonts discovered their relationship, they would use it against them, threatening one to control the other. But they could not stop themselves. After so many years of isolation, of being treated as a monster, Moses had finally found someone who saw him as a man. And Delilah, after losing everyone she loved, had finally found someone worth loving again. In January of 1857, Delilah discovered she was pregnant. The news should have been joyful. A child was a miracle, a promise of continuity, a reason to hope. But in the world of slavery, a child was also property. Any baby born to Delilah would belong to Colonel Beaumont from its first breath. It would grow up enslaved, subject to the same horrors that Moses and Delilah had endured. And if the child was born with Moses's disfigurement, its fate would be even worse. Moses held Delilah while she told him, feeling her body tremble against his. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Moses had been planning for years, reading, learning, preparing. But he had always imagined his revenge would be a solitary act, a final statement before capture or death. He had not planned for a family. He had not planned for something worth living for. Now everything changed. "We are going to leave," Moses said. "We are going to escape, and we are going to take our child to freedom." Delilah looked at him. "How they'll hunt us? Your face, they'll recognize you anywhere. We wouldn't get 10 miles. Moses smiled, a rare expression that transformed his ruined features into something almost gentle. "Let me worry about my face. You just worry about keeping yourself and our baby healthy. We leave in October, during Madame Beaumont's birthday celebration. The whole plantation will be distracted. And by the time they realize we're gone, it will be too late." Too late for what? Moses' smile faded, replaced by something harder. Too late to save themselves. The months leading up to October 1857 were the busiest of Moses' life. He continued his degrading duties during the day, cleaning latrines, hauling bodies, serving at dinner parties, enduring the endless humiliations that had defined his existence. But at night, in the darkness of his cabin, and in secret meetings with Father Marchand, he prepared. First, the money. Moses began stealing from the Beaumonts tiny amounts that wouldn't be noticed. A coin here, a piece of silver there. Over the months, he accumulated nearly $200 in cash and valuables, enough to buy silence, bribe guards, pay for passage. Second, the information. Moses studied Bellefontaine more intensely than ever before. He memorized the schedules of every overseer, the habits of every guard, the layout of every building. He identified the weak points in the plantation's security, the gaps that could be exploited. Third, the weapons. Moses had no access to guns or knives, but he had something else, knowledge. He knew how to make simple weapons from materials available to him. He fashioned a blade from a piece of scrap metal, sharpening it against a stone until it could cut through leather. He created small smoke bombs from chemicals he found in the storage buildings, devices that could create confusion and cover his escape. Fourth, the documents. Moses knew the most dangerous secrets were not physical, but informational. Through careful observation and occasional theft, he accumulated evidence of Colonel Beaumont's activities, letters that revealed illegal business dealings, records of bribes paid to local officials, and most damning of all, correspondence that proved the colonel's involvement in a conspiracy to assassinate a state legislator who had proposed reforms to the treatment of slaves. Moses copied the most incriminating documents in his careful handwriting and hid them in multiple locations. If anything happened to him, this information would still come to light. The colonel's secrets would be exposed regardless. And fifth, the revenge. Moses had not forgotten the years of torment, the humiliations, the beatings, the constant reminders that he was less than human. He had forgiven none of it, and he had a plan to make the Beaumont family pay for everything they had done. Not just to him, to every slave who had ever suffered on this plantation, to every family torn apart, to every life destroyed in the name of profit and power. The Beaumonts thought Moses was a monster. They had treated him like an animal for 32 years. They had no idea that the real monster was not his face, but his mind, and that mind had been planning their destruction for years. October 17, 1857, arrived with clear skies and cool temperatures. It was the perfect day for a celebration, and Madame Beaumont intended to make the most of it. Her 50th birthday party would be the social event of the season. Over 100 guests had been invited from plantations across Louisiana. Caterers had been brought in from New Orleans. Musicians would play until dawn. Champagne would flow like water. Moses watched the preparations from the shadows, observing the chaos of activity that would provide his cover. Servants ran everywhere, setting up tables, arranging flowers, preparing food. Guests began arriving in the late afternoon, their carriages filling the circular drive in front of the mansion. Men in tailored suits and women in imported gowns stepped out, greeting each other with kisses and handshakes, ready for an evening of excess. Moses went through his normal duties, appearing as invisible and subservient as always. He served drinks. He cleaned up spills. He endured the usual comments about his appearance. Good God, Saline, must we look at that thing while we eat? Adds to the ambience, doesn't it? Like a gargoyle at a cathedral. Inside, Moses was counting down the hours. At 8:00 p.m., the party was in full swing. The main hall of the mansion blazed with candlelight. A string quartet played Mozart. Guests danced and laughed and drank and ate, celebrating the birthday of a woman who had built her happiness on the misery of hundreds. At 9:00 p.m., Moses slipped away from the party. No one noticed. No one ever noticed Moses unless they wanted to mock him. He made his way to the cabin where Delilah was waiting. She was ready, dressed in dark clothes, carrying a small bundle containing everything they would take with them. Her face was calm, but Moses could see the fear in her eyes. "It's time," he said. "I know." She took his hand. "I'm ready." Moses squeezed her fingers gently. "Go to the edge of the swamp where we practiced. Wait for me there. I'll come within the hour." "What are you going to do?" Moses did not answer directly. Instead, he kissed her forehead, feeling the warmth of her skin, memorizing the moment. "I'm going to make sure no one follows us." He watched her disappear into the darkness. Then he turned back toward the mansion, toward the celebration, toward the family that had tormented him for 32 years. It was time to settle accounts. The first stop was Colonel Beaumont's private study. Moses had cleaned this room hundreds of times. He knew every inch of it. The mahogany desk imported from England, the leather chairs, the shelves lined with books the colonel had never read. He knew where Beaumont kept his important documents, in a locked drawer on the left side of the desk. He knew where the safe was hidden behind a portrait of the colonel's father. The lock on the drawer yielded easily to Moses's improvised picks. Inside, he found exactly what he expected: contracts, deeds, financial records, and the letters he had seen before. The letters that proved Beaumont's involvement in conspiracy and corruption. Moses took the most damaging documents and tucked them into his shirt. The rest he scattered across the floor, making sure they would be found. The safe was more challenging. It was a heavy iron box with a combination lock, the kind that could not be picked. But Moses had prepared for this. Over the past months, he had watched Colonel Beaumont open the safe on 3 separate occasions, carefully observing the movements of his fingers. The combination was 8-23-47, the birth date of Beaumont's late mother. The safe opened with a satisfying click. Inside was cash, nearly $3,000 in bills and gold coins. There were also jewelry boxes containing pieces Madame Beaumont wore only on special occasions. And there were more documents even more incriminating than the ones in the drawer. Moses took everything. The second stop was the wine cellar. Bellefontaine's wine collection was famous throughout Louisiana. Colonel Beaumont had spent decades acquiring rare vintages from France, Spain, Italy, and Germany. The cellar contained over 5,000 bottles, worth more than many plantations. Moses did not touch the wine. Instead, he went to the back of the cellar where barrels of brandy and whiskey were stored for everyday use. He opened the taps on 3 of the largest barrels, letting the alcohol pour out onto the stone floor. It would take hours for anyone to notice, and by then, thousands of dollars worth of spirits would have drained away. But that was not the main purpose. The alcohol spreading across the floor would serve another function soon. The third stop was the stable. Moses opened every stall door and cut every rope. The horses did not bolt immediately. They were confused by the sudden freedom. But Moses knew something would startle them before the night was over. When it did, they would run, and the plantation would lose its fastest means of pursuit.